Hello and welcome to the Indie Media Show. I'm Robin Seidel.
Hello, my name is Candace Kong, live from Zuni Pueblo, and we're more than happy to host this show.
Today we'll be talking about the New Mexico Environment Department's upcoming hearings on the DOE's request to dig a new shaft as part of an expansion of the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, WIPP. To talk about what this means for the health and safety and economy of New Mexico, we have two very special guests.
Leona Morgan is a Diné activist and founder of the Nuclear Issues Study Group. Thank you for joining us, Leona.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
And we also have Don Hancock, Director of the Nuclear Waste Program at Southwest Research and Information Center. Don, thanks for coming out today.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Don, let's start with you. Can you remind us what WIPP is and some of the promises that the state and the federal government made to the people of New Mexico before we agreed to accept the nation's really only nuclear waste repository?
Yes, WIPP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, is the world's only operating deep geologic repository for nuclear waste. And it's located about 26 miles east of Carlsbad in southeastern New Mexico. Importantly, it's surrounded by more than 500 oil and gas wells within 2.5 miles of the site, which creates a lot of concerns about the safety of the facility. It was first cited in the early 1970s, and there was various proposals that the federal government made in the 1970s and 80s about what WIPP would be. As a result of that and public concern, the mission of WIPP was limited in several ways. In 1981, the state and the Department of Energy entered into a consultation and cooperation agreement, it was called, to provide some limits so that to try to make sure this was the first, but not the only, repository. And so limits were put on the types of waste, just transuranic waste, plutonium contaminated waste for making nuclear weapons. It was prohibited to have commercial waste or commercial spent fuel or high-level waste. And limits in the amount, 6.2 million cubic feet of waste, which is much less than the amount of that waste that actually exists. And later on then, in 1992, the Congress passed a law, the WIPP Land Withdrawal Act, that also incorporated those limits and the consultation and cooperation agreement, and also provided for some federal and some state regulation of the facility. So all of these promises and laws were then incorporated into the WIPP permit under the Hazardous Waste Act. And the reason it's hazardous waste is WIPP is not just radioactive, but it has toxic chemical waste as well. So that permit was first issued in 1999. It was renewed in 2010. We're pending yet another renewal for it. But importantly, WIPP was supposed to operate for 25 years. So 2024, under the permit, is when the facility is supposed to be closing.
So we're coming to that closing date very shortly, but I remember that there was an accident in 2014, or a couple of accidents.
Yeah.
Serious accidents.
Yes, actually in February of 2014 there were two accidents. One, a fire in the underground. One of the poorly maintained trucks caught on fire and caused evacuation of the facility. 9 days later, there was a radiation release from the underground that contaminated more than 8,000 feet of the underground tunnels, 2,150 feet up to the surface. The exhaust shaft contaminated 22 workers on the surface. Wow. And contaminated the environment. So as a result of that, waste operations were suspended for 3 years. Since 2017, it's continued to operate, but at a much slower rate. In fact, the workers in the underground handling waste look like your hospital workers treating COVID patients. Wow. They're in full protective gear because of the contamination.
So given that the WIPP is going to close in 2024, it seems really odd to me that they're suddenly going to dig this new shaft.
Well, that's right, and it doesn't make any sense. The facility was designed to handle the waste that we talked about in underground rooms. This new shaft is part of what the Department of Energy's been doing as kind of a piecemeal expansion. They don't want to say the overall plan is to keep WIPP open forever, to put a lot more waste in it, to break the promises, to break the agreements, to want to change the permit to allow this. They want to do one small change, they say, at a time. So the current small change is just this new shaft, which they say would help the airflow in the underground, but that's not really what it's for.
Right. The GAO, if I recall correctly, says it's a utility shaft, and it seems like it's going to be big enough to implant more waste and do all the kinds of things that a utility shaft would do.
Well, it was originally going to replace the existing contaminated exhaust shaft, but now, because they want to expand the facility, they've located this new shaft, proposed new shaft, 1,200 feet west of any of the existing shafts or the underground disposal rooms, so that it's conveniently located to the west, where, guess what? In the future, they want to build more rooms and to more than double the size of the amount of waste that they can handle. So that's the kind of thing that people are concerned about. As a result of that, hundreds of people have objected to this new shaft and said no to it.
Right. And I also remember hearing that there's a brand new filter building.
So the filter...
to take care of the ventilation issue that you raised.
So the filter building is needed because of the contamination. Because the facility is contaminated in the underground, the air coming out is contaminated and it needs to be filtered to filter out the radioactivity. So that's already under construction. That's already been permitted. That's supposed to provide enough ventilation. So again, the new shaft is not for that. People have objected to that and have said, that's not okay. We need to talk about the entire plan that you have, what would be entailed in breaking the promises, changing the agreements, and in fact, people don't agree to that. So that's the reason that people are concerned, and the Stop Forever WIPP Coalition got started to say people all over the state were concerned about the expansion, and so it's a way that people can work together. And there's a website, the Stop Forever WIPP Coalition, that has a lot of information about what's going on and how people can be more involved.
Right, and that Stop Forever WIPP Coalition website is www.stopforeverwip.org, and we are so lucky to have Candace with us because she is the social media coordinator or director of the Stop Forever WIPP Coalition. Candace.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robin, for bringing that up. From what you said, Don, New Mexico is being targeted as a sacrifice area for nuclear waste, once again, by the nuclear industry. As a Native person, I am aware of the environmental justice issues we as Native people have gone through. Leona, can you talk about the ongoing nuclear colonization of our people and our homeland?
Yeah, thank you, Candace. First, I want to start by introducing myself in my language. Well, we really can't start talking about WIPP and all of these expansions in relation to nuclear colonialism without first looking at the cumulative impacts of the whole nuclear fuel chain. Basically, when we are talking about nuclear colonialism, we're talking about the ongoing systematic theft, the ongoing removal, oppression, and basically genocide of indigenous peoples. And so right now, the nuclear industry, if we go back looking at the history, it was really founded on the tenets of exploiting our Mother Earth, and there's actually a lot of laws that were tools that helped in colonization of our lands. So when people ask me, well, how much of this is affecting indigenous lands, I always say 100%, because the entire country, as we know, is stolen indigenous lands now occupied by the so-called United States, which propagated, all of this from the beginning, starting with the Manhattan Project. And so when we look at the Manhattan Project, it really, the biggest impact that we are still dealing with right now is the 15,000 plus abandoned uranium mines across the nation. And what resulted from the Manhattan Project, as everyone knows, is the weapons that were created and used in World War II. And what a lot of people don't know is that the first weapon that was ever used was here in New Mexico at the Trinity site. And that impacted the local community, as Tina Cordova, one of the one of the most outspoken advocates on this issue, she is with the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, and she talks about this as, impacting an unknowing, unwilling community of people. And that can be said of all of the stages of the nuclear fuel chain. So going back to the uranium mining issue, my nation, the Diné Navajo Nation, has been one of the most impacted in the country. Uranium mining impacts indigenous peoples mostly worldwide because these are mines that are still there, especially in the United States. The stories that I've heard, they are heard all over the country. So you can just replace, the different types of mining and the different indigenous peoples, and we're dealing with ongoing impacts to our culture through contamination of our water, our sacred places, and basically how we use our Mother Earth. And so all over the state of New Mexico, this can be seen at places like, as I mentioned, the 15,000 abandoned mines across the country. But in New Mexico, there were over 1,500 that were mines that produced uranium. And there's about 500, close to 500 that were abandoned. And then you can see the same impacts of ongoing contamination and impacts to indigenous lifeways around Los Alamos, of course in the Tularosa Basin, and then even in the Rio Grande Valley, where a lot of pueblos are located. Los Alamos particularly impacts mostly the San Ildefonso and Santa Clara pueblos. There's always ongoing releases of radiation, and then now we're dealing with proposed expansions at Los Alamos for plutonium pits, and then the increase of the facility there. This is ongoing today, which means removal and which means more health impacts to communities. And in New Mexico, our population is a majority people of color. And so the impacts are not just to indigenous peoples, but everyone across the state. And so when we look at the cumulative impacts of the nuclear industry, we have to consider the impacts of uranium mining, and then of course the weapons complex, and then that is also intrinsically connected to the energy production. In New Mexico, we don't have any nuclear power plants, but we're dealing with a threat of 2 proposals for waste sites for waste from all of the nuclear power plants in the country. This is called consolidated interim storage. And so again, it's a national issue, but in New Mexico, we're being forced to bear the burden of the nation's most toxic, lethal, radioactive waste. And one of the sites is only 14 miles north of WIPP, which is the focus of today's conversation. But when we look at all of these and the cumulative impact to our peoples, expansions at WIPP, that only further encourages more production of weapons and more production of waste. And because some of the byproducts of nuclear energy are used in nuclear weapons, to have all of these waste sites located in New Mexico only, like I said, encourages more production of waste from both the weapons complex and the energy side. And so right now we're dealing with expansions, not just at WIPP, like I mentioned, Los Alamos and other places, but when you add on the threat of new uranium mining, because there's this false solution, which is a push for increased nuclear production, which is being called low carbon, and some people even say zero carbon, which is entirely untrue because they calculate the carbon footprint of nuclear energy only at the power plant, not including all of the mining and the processing and transport, and then of course having to deal with the waste storage, which is going to be forever. And so what I like to say is they just, how do you calculate the carbon footprint of forever? You really can't, so they just conveniently leave it out. But there's a lot of stuff happening today, especially dealing with uranium cleanup.
That's really good information, Leona. I have a question. Zuni Pueblo is just downstream from Church Rock. Would you like to talk about what's happening there currently?
Yes, thanks, Candace. Yeah, I went to high school in Gallup, New Mexico, and a lot of people that live in Gallup and the surrounding communities have no idea that the world's largest uranium spill took place just about 15 miles northwest of Gallup in a small community called Redwater Pond Road, which is actually about 12 miles north of Church Rock proper. And so in Church Rock, this is one of the most contaminated areas from uranium mining. The Diné community, Redwater Pond Road, they live within the area of 3 abandoned uranium mines and a uranium mill. And so this is the site where the 1979 Church Rock spill occurred, when the company United Nuclear Corporation knew that they were using a compromised waste cell. And so in the early morning of July 16th, 1979, the wall that was containing the liquid radioactive waste broke, and over 90 million gallons of radioactive waste flowed into a ditch that connected to the Puerco River, and then all of that made its way westward into Arizona. Well, they calculate, about 90 million gallons, but there was also 1,100 tons of solid radioactive waste. And so right now, there is a proposal for cleanup of this site, which is currently owned by General Electric. And so the proposal is to clean up, the proposal is to clean up the mine, which is the Northeast Church Rock mine. And so what they're saying is to move 1 million cubic yards of mine waste basically across the street, on top of the existing mill waste, and then to leave it there forever. So on Navajo Nation, this is one of the places that's getting attention for some of the 15,000 abandoned uranium mines. There's cleanup that has been ongoing, and the Navajo Nation is working with 5 federal agencies to clean up 524 abandoned uranium mine sites. But this is not really cleanup. When we say cleanup, the communities think they're going to move the waste out and move it away from the community. But what's happening is just the creation of 524 permanent radioactive waste sites. And so this situation in Church Rock is going through a public comment right now. And the deadline is May 27th. For more information, you can go to our website. I'm also an organizer with Hall No, so the website is hallno.com. There's some information about the cleanup and then how to comment on the website. We'll be updating it next week with talking points. But yeah, this is just one way that the federal government is creating a huge nuclear waste site, in addition to the threat of WIPP expansions and then the 2 CIS sites I mentioned. So one of the things I just want to leave the audience with is to consider that the U.S. is planning to move waste all the way across the country to New Mexico to go into WIPP or at either of the 2 sites proposed by Holtec, our waste control specialists. But on Navajo Nation, their cleanup, they're just only pushing it across the street and not even considering what the community has been asking for a long time, which is to move it out of the area. Thanks.
That is truly awful, but again, go to the website that she mentioned to find out more information and to get involved. If the new shaft and the expansion are approved in the incoming months, we'll be seeing tons of plutonium and other radioactive contaminants on our roads for decades to come. Cynthia Wheeler of 285 Neighborhood Association has made 3 short videos about what is at risk for our communities and neighborhoods. Watch these and make your own.
This is my neighborhood. The school, the volunteer fire station, bicycle paths. And this is the road that goes past my neighborhood. There's nothing special about my neighborhood except this road. This is Highway 285, and it's the designated route for radioactive waste shipments in New Mexico. It goes past Santa Fe, El Dorado, Lamy, and all the way down to Roswell and Carlsbad. These shipments of nuclear weapons waste leave Los Alamos Lab to be disposed of in the dump we call WIPP, Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. The WIPP dump has received shipments along this road for 22 years, and there's already been an explosion of one of the radioactive drums that traveled 285. The federal government promised the dump would stop taking more waste in 2024, 3 years from now. We hoped we just might get through this bad plan without any more accidents. But now the feds are planning to break their promises to New Mexicans and ship nuclear waste from weapons across the nation to the WIPP dump and keep shipping it past our neighborhoods for decades, to 2080 and beyond. If you live in a neighborhood like mine, or if your community is now at risk by being on the route that will crisscross at least 7 states, call your governor. Tell your governor that you don't want more WIPP waste going past your home for decades. Tell your governor to say no. Governor Lujan Grisham's number is 505-476-2200. It's not just my neighborhood that's at risk from these radioactive waste shipments to the WIPP dump, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. It's our neighborhoods, and most of us don't even know it. Note to the DOE, if you're going to put people at risk, at least make sure they know about it. It's not even just my state. The Department of Energy plans a 3,300-mile road trip that crosses at least 7 states. Is your neighborhood at risk? Let's trace the route and see how many communities will see these shipments. Most of this surplus nuclear weapons waste is currently at the Pantex plant in Amarillo, Texas, but it can't go directly to WIPP. It needs to be processed, so we assume it will travel west on Interstate 40, past valuable ranching and farming communities in Texas and New Mexico, and towns like Tucumcari and Santa Rosa. At Highway 285, it will travel north past 24 neighborhoods, skirt the southern edge of Santa Fe on I-25 South, and connect with Highway 599. Again, many neighborhoods lay along this corridor. At Highway 502, shipments pass 4 pueblos before arriving at Los Alamos National Labs for processing. The waste then retraces the route it just traveled, the same plutonium in a different form, past the same neighborhoods. We assume it will travel all the way down Highway 285, past Roswell and Artesia, into Texas to connect with Interstate 20, the most direct route to South Carolina, where the waste is processed again. Finally, it once again retraces the same I-20 path back to disposal in WIPP. It passes all these communities, all these neighborhoods. Is one of them yours? If your neighborhood is on this route, did you know? My neighbors don't. Being at risk means at least knowing about it and having a voice. Our homes and livelihoods are being put at risk by a federal government that hopes we're looking the other way. Don't look away. Call the governor of your state and tell them you want to know more about the DOE's plan and that you don't want radioactive waste going past your home for all these decades to come. In New Mexico, Governor Lujan Grisham's number is 505-476-2200. I think a lot of people watch these videos and wonder why I'm so worried about nuclear waste traveling past our neighborhoods. I mean, after all, most of us have lived with the existence of nuclear waste all our lives. But in reality, it's only existed on this planet for about 70 years. The government tells us it knows how to handle it, but explosions like the one at WIPP, that occurred after only 15 years of operation and shut it down for 3 years is evidence that no one knows where all the risks are. An accident with nuclear waste is not like other accidents. It's long-lived and catastrophic, and that's what I want to talk about right now. So if WIPP's expanded, the new waste will be different from the waste it's taken in until now. It will be concentrated plutonium, the triggers from decommissioned nuclear bombs. It's very radioactive and so long-lived that it remains radioactive for almost 500,000 years. During transport, it will be in various states, starting with these solid triggers, and then a powdered oxide, and finally a mixture. Moving it when it's a solid and a powder, which is more than half the transport, it's very vulnerable to terrorists who could use it to create bombs. Plutonium in the powdered form is the most concerning state from an accident point of view. Plutonium released in this state is easily carried by breezes and wind. It's invisible, odorless, and tasteless, and it would be inhaled by people without their awareness, even before emergency crews would have time to arrive. So imagine who we're talking about inhaling a sudden release. Children outside at school, bicyclists and walkers, people in houses with their windows open. Just by breathing, all these people could bring these tiny particles into their lungs, where they lodge in lung tissue and provide a continuous and ongoing source of radiation. This is how plutonium causes lung, liver, and bone cancers. A few millionths of a gram of inhaled plutonium causes cancer, with children the most at risk because they have the longest amount of time for a cancer to develop. But health isn't the only concern with small plutonium particles. A significant release is almost impossible to clean up. Sandia National Labs predicts that a 2 square kilometer area of contamination would need to be evacuated, the soil scraped and bagged, structures like houses would have to be torn down, and possessions might need to be left behind. So back to the risk of accidents. I believe most officials when they say they take transportation safety seriously. We're told accidents are extremely unlikely, and probably if the plan to transport these materials were over a shorter distance and time frame, we might just make it to the finish line without an accident. But LANL and WIPP have poor safety records with packaging and labeling waste specifically. I think common sense tells us that transporting this material over hundreds of thousands of miles for almost a century, an accident is probably almost inevitable. And these are the risks that the DOE is assuming we're willing to take, unless we tell them we're not. We can do something to help the governor say no to the WIPP expansion. You can protect your neighborhoods, and we'll talk more about that on the last video. Remember, Governor Lujan Grisham's number is 505-476-2200.
Thanks to Cindy for her excellent work on these videos. We really appreciate it. And we also want to recognize what you said, Leona, about the impacts on Native communities in your neighborhood. So it's really clear that these wastes have significant impacts. And right now, New Mexicans have an opportunity to weigh in on how they feel and what their concerns are about the new shaft and its relation to the expansion of WIPP and the bringing of all this waste to New Mexico. So Dawn, could you please tell us a little bit about the May 17th hearing?
So the hearing is by the New Mexico Environment Department. It starts on May 17th at noon. There will be a public comment section time at 6 p.m. on May 17th. And then the hearing will proceed May 18th, 19th, and maybe beyond that. So on May 18th at noon and at 6 p.m., And May 19th at noon and 6 p.m., there will be opportunities for people to make comments at this hearing, which is done on Zoom. So anybody with access to a phone or the internet will be able to sign in and participate, and we encourage people to do that.
And you can see at the bottom of the screen the www.stopforeverwhip.org. There's a lot of information on that website about how you can comment. There are sample letters that you can email. We would request that you send in that letter before May 17th and that you comment orally and let folks know what your concerns are regarding this. I want to thank our wonderful guests. Thank you so much, Leona. It's wonderful to be here with you. Thanks for all your good work.
Thanks, Robin.
And Dawn, of course, from SRIC, Southwest Research and Information Center. You have really been a leader in helping New Mexicans understand this issue, so thank you to you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And to my wonderful co-host, Candace, out there at Zuni. Hi,
pleasure.
Candace. So watch for more indie media shows from Available Media on issues that are important to the people of New Mexico. And we are your co-hosts. I'm Robin.
And I'm Candace.
And we invite you to stay aware and stay active. Thanks. Bye.